The member made an unparliamentary remark earlier on. I don't know whether he realised it, but unintended. But I just asked the member to be very careful with some of the language. I didn't put him up at the time, but I just mentioned that I'm sure it was unintended, and I'm not asking to take it further. I call Dr. Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the comments of my previous speaker, my colleague Stuart Nash, in acknowledging the concerns of the Green Party. And in fact, I think the debate both in the Hong Kong FTA and the whole stages of this Malaysian FTA debate has been with the singular exception of John Hayes, I think has been very constructive indeed. And I welcome that from all other National Party colleagues, not least Chris Tremaine. I would make the point, however, sir, that nothing I have heard, and I have listened very closely to everything that's been said in both the Hong Kong and Malaysian debates, nothing that has been said changes our view with regard to the current manifestation of trade policy. In the second reading, John Hayes simply said China's exports have increased $860 million. Fantastic. Yes, we recognise that. It's a significant thing. It is not everything. Chris Tremaine admonished me to steer clear of theoretical models, and I appreciate that. I assure him that I shall not, but that I shall add a touch of practicality now and again to it to satisfy him and his constituents. But having offered the admonishment, he basically spoke in tones of awe, and we can speak in tones of admiration, but not awe, of Zespri. And that was his contribution. Cam Calder said that the FTAs boost exports, create jobs, increase income. True, not the total story. And Tim McIndoe mentioned the environmental protocols, Morris Dancing, and the students in Asia. In his electorate, in fact I know that very well, having just been to Waikato University recently and spoken to them at the Pacific College. And of course Tim Grosser said that free trade is not a religion, though nonetheless spoke in papal tones, and now and again unctuously. And I just make the point that everything that the government members have said is focused on exports, and at no stage did they really address the issue of the effect on the domestic New Zealand economy, which is only one of the things that we are trying to get this House to focus on. The government is either blind or willful and is not doing so, not focusing. On the point of style, I would just say that at least colleague Tim McIndoe and Chris Tremaine and others at least offered their derision in tones of good humour, and that is appreciated. That cannot be said for John Hayes, whose tones of patronising attitude rendered with supercilious tones and comments was quite different indeed, and I will not reduce the dignity of the House any further by responding in kind, and I could. But just on the note of, if we're going to be competitively Google or googly competitive on this thing, I just offer the response that I actually studied Ricardo back in the 1960s. He and I are much the same age. I know Ricardo's theories very well indeed. In fact, you can go from Ricardo through Smith and Mill, Malthus, Marshall, Gervons, and Keynes, and Samuelson, and Hicks, and Friedman. Yes, Friedman, to understand economics, the theory of economics and the theory of trade. And I ask and suggest that John Hayes goes through all of those as well. It doesn't stop with Ricardo. It only began with Ricardo. And in fact, having done that, having completed that stony pilgrim's path, he would then, by invitation from me, investigate the whole theory of ecological economics, which is where the Green Party is coming from. And if we recognise each other's theoretical framework with dignity and explore them, perhaps we have a reasoned dialogue. And I think every other member, except for the chairman of this committee, incidentally, Mr. Speaker, will be prepared to do that. And I invite them to study Tim Jackson, Herman Daly, we can do Googles on it, Tim Jackson, Herman Daly, Peter Victor, Robert Costanza and J.R. McNeill. then we will understand ecological economics, both the domestic dimension of it and the free trade dimension. Now, all of that is simply to say that the Green Party, having just been misrepresented, requires a reiteration of our policy. We are not against trade, which is what Mr. Hayes was misrepresenting. We are against unsustainable trade. We are against unfair trade. The government's trade policy, sir, rests on a commitment to a neoliberal, yes, neoliberal free trade. Globalised free trade is the manifestation of the problem of the globalised economy. The case for free trade rests on the assumption that trade is voluntary. This is getting at what Mr. Hayes suggested we do get at. Both parties must be better off than before the Voluntary Act. When trade is based on the absolute advantage enjoyed by the countries for the commodities in question, this is self-evident. But the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage also justifies trade, even when one country may have absolute advantage over another in all goods. The theory is that the combined production of all countries trading is greater than if they produce separately, and each country stands to gain individually, even if not to the same extent. That's the Ricardo theory. This theory derives from the fundamental tenets of neoclassical economics, for the benefit of Mr. Tremaine again. The Green Party considers these tenets to be dangerously obsolescent, requiring refinement with a new approach that reflects the economic conditions of the 21st century. Specifically, let me make a number of points. First, the extra combined production from free trade cannot in fact be achieved without extra resource inputs. There is also the increase in the depletion rate of the natural resource base from which the product is made. What trade economists mean when they say, quote, no extra resources, is simply no additional labour or financial capital. Neoclassical economics omits natural capital in its theory. Second, the extra transport costs associated with free trade are not included in the theory. International transport is energy intensive, often subsidised. Its external costs are omitted from the pricing. Sea trade emits 0.8 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide, 3% of anthropogenic emissions, and this is expected to grow threefold by 2050. The same is expected of aviation and surface freight. Third, free trade assumes the cost of specialisation to be negligible, but in fact it requires retraining and perhaps physical relocation. And as specialisation shrinks the economic sectoral breadth of a country, job choice narrows. This comprises a loss to human welfare. The invisible hand has narrowed the freedom to choose. 4. Although free trade agreements have withdrawal clauses such that New Zealand can theoretically opt out if trade becomes disadvantageous, this assumes that specialisation is reversible. But in fact, retraining and relocation of a furniture maker into a dairy share milker, apart from being socially traumatic, may be irreversible for social communal reasons. Fifth, the specialisation resulting from free trade bequeaths a narrow range of sectoral products country by country, making each country vulnerable to the vagaries of the global economy. Taking the argument to the extreme, if New Zealand were to narrow its sectoral breadth, and this is what Mr. Hayes and perhaps even Mr. Grosser are suggesting, if New Zealand were to narrow its sectoral breadth to a national dairy farm, surrendering its capacity to maintain other economic activities, it would become a milk colony to the global economy. Finally, much international trade is pursued in the name of choice to ludicrous lengths. When marginally different varieties of ice cream, biscuits and crackers pass east and west across the Tasman in the night, such activity defies not only consumer rationality, but in an age of climate change, defies basic common sense. Sir, there are both theoretical and very practical and moral and environmental reasons not to pursue free trade agreements in the current form that they are manifest. For that reason, the Green Party will oppose this bill.
Jackie Dean.
Mr. Chairman, this Malaysian free trade agreement represents significant opportunities for New Zealand, and while it's my pleasure to follow on from the contribution of the Green member on the green economics, I have a slightly different view. That might be because I am a rural-based MP who represents the farming sector. So here is my take on this Malaysia Free Trade Agreement. And my take is that New Zealand, first